Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new talk as part of our Understanding 2 conference. This conference is organized by the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Bucharest, jointly with CELFIS, that's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the same university, and the ICUB Humanities, that's the Research Institute at the same university. The postdoctoral grant that supported organizing the conference is wonderfully provided by UFSCD, the local public funding agency for research in Romania. And that project has the following code, and that is PN-3 Roman P1-1.1-PD-2019-0535. And we're very grateful to our public sponsor. Our first speaker on this second day of our conference is Andrei Moldovan. Andrei comes from the University of Salamanca. He's a fantastic scholar and a dear friend, so I'm very happy to introduce him. Technical language is evidence of expertise. Andrei, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me express my gratitude for inviting me and for congratulating you for organizing the conference, and also express my gratitude for all of you who are here at this time early in the afternoon. The topic that I'm going to talk about is kind of indirectly related to understanding, because it's more about non-understanding or situations in which an audience fails to understand what the speaker says. It relates to a project that we have here in Salamanca on the notion of expertise and expert knowledge on social, argumentative, epistemic dimensions of expertise. The very kind of phenomenon I'm going to look into is the one mentioned in the title. So it's about technical language that is used as evidence of expertise. A topic that has not been much discussed in epistemology or argumentation theory, as far as I can tell. I haven't found much substantial discussions. It's sometimes mentioned very briefly, but not. Well, there is no substantial literature, at least as far as I can tell. I would be very grateful if you could help me find out more or connect it to literature that is directly relevant to what I'm going to say. So the talk is not intended to reach any definitive conclusions about this phenomenon. Rather, it's a way of mapping the territory, of getting a first grasp on the phenomenon. And I'm going to make some comments from different perspectives on how on this phenomenon, and I hope it is not too well. I hope you will find it at least a promising topic to incorporate into your research. I'm not sure whether what I'm going to say is really controversial, problematic, or on the contrary, sometimes a little too obvious. And in that case, again, I would be very grateful if you could let me know. Okay. So this is the contents, the index of the talk. I will be introducing the phenomenon briefly, then looking at some examples, and then making some comments about it from different perspectives, from a pragmatic perspective, from an epistemic perspective, considering the evidence that is given, and from the perspective of how persuasive this is, or might be in certain contexts. Okay, the kind of language I'm going to talk about is not only scientific language, but any kind of theoretical language or technical language that might belong even to pseudosciences or pseudo-scientific discourse, or to technical discourse pertaining to the law or pertaining even to philosophy. In all these cases, there's a problem that occurs, an epistemic problem that Alvin Goldman has called the novice expert problem. His paper is called "Who Should We Trust?" and it tries to answer this question from the perspective of a novice, somebody who is not an expert or does not have sufficient knowledge to evaluate the claims that a putative expert makes. How should that person decide whether the expert is to be trusted or whether it's a real expert or not? How laypersons should evaluate the testimony of experts? There is agreement in the literature, as far as I can tell, that the kind of judgments that we make in these situations are indirect judgments. That is, we do not really evaluate the claims that are being made, but rather we look at cues and evidence for expertise in the person or related to the person or to the context of the person who speaks. Harry Collins and Robert Evans have very much cited book called Rethinking Expertise, in which they say that citizens are making social judgments about who ought to be agreed with, not scientific judgments about what ought to be believed. In turn, this creates a situation in which the expert needs to put forward evidence that they are expert, that they have expert knowledge on that topic. Sara Sorial writes, persons with expertise thus typically appeal to audiences to accept their views by emphasizing who they are rather than what they say, by giving indications and clues of the kind of expert knowledge that they have. Now, these clues or these pieces of evidence that experts might give might be broadly distinguished into two classes, like more direct ways or explicit ways and more indirect ways. Direct ways might be asserting that one is an expert in such and such a field, or implying that this is so, or presupposing it by what one asserts, that one is expert on a certain field, or maybe citing research results, Hirsch index of a certain of the researcher, or of a journal where the researcher has published, the impact factor, the famous editorial houses, and so on. Maybe giving names of the profession, Professor Taylor, and so on, qualifications that indicate that one is an expert on the topic, PhD in microbiology, and so on, prizes, Nobel Prize winner, so and so, Nobel Prize winner, so and so, and or names of the institution that one is affiliated at, such as World Health Organization, University of so and so Research Institute, etc. But there are also more indirect ways, which might be nonverbal, such as details of a scenario when an interview is taken to an expert. Usually the setting of that interview might be in a science lab, or might be in a context that suggests expertise or invites us to think that that person is an expert. Clothing details, wearing a white coat, having a stethoscope hanging on one's neck, right, to suggest that one is medical doctor or something. But there are also verbal cues I want to suggest, and these are, among these, we find showing competence with the technical language. In addressing a lay audience, a speaker might intentionally use technical jargon, technical vocabulary, even in those situations in which she knows that language is incomprehensible to the audience. Sticking with this situation, a novice expert, right? So an expert that talks to somebody who is a layperson, needs to give evidence. So they will use a language that might be partially or totally incomprehensible to that audience. Now, this general phenomenon of using language that somebody doesn't understand or speech that somebody cannot follow has been studied in communication studies by a few people who have come with this label, communication accommodation theory, which is a very descriptive approach of what is going on in situations in which there is a failure of understanding between the speaker and them. Not necessarily concerning technical language. It might be somebody who speaks a language that the other person just doesn't understand, or uses a vocabulary that doesn't speak loud enough, and the other person has some sort of hearing impairment, maybe. These situations are common. And they introduce a distinction that I think is useful between accommodative speech and non-accommodative speech. Accommodative speech is, well, as the name suggests, a situation or a kind of speech in which the speaker makes an effort to achieve common understanding and is trying to make sure that the other gets the right message. While non-accommodative speech is a situation in which speakers purposefully or unintendedly do not pay sufficient attention to the cognitive needs of audiences. And here's a quote from Jessica Gasiorek, one of the promoters of this approach. She writes that adjustments that make a message more difficult to understand, speaking a language an interlocutor does not know, using unfamiliar jargon, speaking quickly, are considered non-accommodative moves in terms of interpretability. Here's one example, and it also involves technical language. It's a comic strip from Dilbert, who I also found in the Lepore and Stone's book on convention and imagination. So what Alice says here is just disable the local cache mode to fix the MAPI settings and delete the duplicate messaging subsystem registry P. And Tina says, what if I don't understand anything you said right here? And Alice replies, well, good grief, I can't make it any simpler. And she walks away. Right, so this is an example of non-accommodative behavior, non-accommodative speech, and it also involves a technical language in this case. Now, non-accommodative speech involving technical language in an interaction with a novice might have different motivations, might be the result of having different intentions, not necessarily related to showing expertise. Maybe the speaker is simply not willing to make an effort to accommodate, which is more or less what happens in the comic strip. Doesn't care whether Tina understands or not. Might want to emphasize maybe social difference, right? I'm the professor and you are the student, so let's make this clear. I'm going to use a language that you don't understand to make it clear that there's a social difference. Maybe it's a way to avoid giving a straightforward answer to a question. Somebody might use convoluted vocabulary and technical language that people don't understand, just in order to avoid giving a clear and simple answer, because they don't want to make a commit to a particular answer. But it might have also positive, there might be positive intentions, not necessarily negative ones. So maybe a professor wants to encourage students to use the vocabulary of the theory and knows that the students are not, can't really follow what she's saying, but still uses that language so that they get accustomed to that language and little by little get to know it. Or maybe another case similar to some of the above, to end the conversation. Medical doctor might want to end the conversation with a patient and just says something that the patient doesn't understand, and so on. And one of these uses, these kind of non-accommodative speech involving technical language, is precisely the use of evidence, the use of language, technical language, to provide evidence of the speaker's expertise on this topic. And I focus on, this is what I'm going to focus on, including also those cases in which the technical language is not correctly used. So evidence of putative expertise or alleged expertise, not necessarily good evidence of real expertise. Okay, so some examples. This one is taken from Georg Meyerbauer paper on bullshit, and it's a fragment from an ad for neck lotion. He found in a magazine called Wallpaper, which is a design and style magazine. It's not a specialized or scientific journal or anything like that. And this is just a fragment from the whole ad, and it's filled with a lot of scientific terminology. I'm going to read part of it. In simple terms, neck therapy as its avant-garde finest, protein fractions maximize fibrillin synthesis and minimize the inevitable irreversible degradation of elastic tissue. Discovered on Mars iron rose crystal comes from so-and-so to increase prolyl hydroxylase activity by 381, and so on. So there's no reason the authors of this ad would think the regular reader of the magazine could understand this kind of vocabulary. And so the purpose of using this vocabulary is not to convey information, at least not to convey the information that the language encodes, but rather to impress the reader, to show that they are experts on the science that stands behind the product, that the product is the result of very refined and sophisticated development. But of course, the reader has no way to understand what is bibbling the dipeptide and whether it's better, whether it comes from Switzerland or from somewhere else, or whether that percentage is really a good thing or a bad thing. And so on. Meyerbauer says this is a genuine example of bullshit. I don't know, I'm not going to commit to that, but what I think is an example of non-accommodative technical language, which is used with intention to provide evidence of expertise. Other examples, although these are this is a little different, come from a different kind of discourse. Ellen Sokal and John Brigmont have a book called Fashionable Nonsense, in which they criticize the use that postmodern French philosophers make of scientific results. What he does is provide quotes from different French philosophers and psychologists, such as Jacques Lacan. In this case, Lacan uses the language of geometry, of topology, and invokes results and concepts from topology and connects that to psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and so on. Reading this locus of the other, Lacan says, of one sex as other, as absolute other, what does the most recent development in topology allow us to posit? I will posit here the term compactness. Nothing is more compact than a fault. Assuming that the intersection of everything that is enclosed therein is existing over an infinite number of sets, and so on. Sokal and Brigmont say that this is not, that what he says about these results in topology is not even false. It's just gibberish, and the use of the word of these words is completely out of place here. And they write that superficial erudition, that this is superficial erudition by shamelessly throwing around technical terms in a context where they are completely irrelevant. The goal is no doubt to impress, and above all, to intimidate the non-scientist reader, right? So if we accept their evaluation, what kind of impression? Well, the impression that this is a very sophisticated theory that connects with results, recent results in topology, and so on. So it enhances, in a sense, the level of expertise that the public perceives this Lacan has. That's the intention, at least according to Sokal and Brigmont. And finally, a third and last example, from a clearly pseudo-scientific discourse called theta healing, which is a pseudo-therapy proposed by Viana Stibal, a certain person, in 1995, and which is a meditation technique that supposedly has the capacity to wake up our DNA to our highest potential. And it has been, it comes in many places. It's been listed as a pseudoscience or a pseudotherapy. And what she says, the discourse that she presents and she makes on her webpage includes a lot of scientific terminology. She starts, one of the fragments start by saying, you don't have to be a scientist to do this technique, but so and so. This already suggests that what she's going to say in what follows is something of a kind of scientific information. You don't have to be a scientist, but you have to know these things which are scientific. Well, in fact, they are not, but a lot of scientific terminology is involved. The pineal gland, she says that within the pineal gland there is what is called a master cell, and this cell is the operation center for other cells in the body. The master cell is the beginning point of healing for many of the functions that the body performs. And within the master cell is the chromosome of DNA, that is the heart of the DNA activation, and so on. Anyway, so you can see that there's scientific terminology here mixed up with all kind of intuitive or mystical religious claims. Okay, sorry, I think I lost the slide. Okay. Okay, so in the second part of the talk, I'm going to make some comments on this phenomenon. And I'm going to use a concept from argumentation theory, which is that of a fallacy, not because I think this is a fallacy. In fact, I think it is not, according to most definitions of fallacy, but because the concept of a fallacy or of a fallacious move in an argumentative discourse is useful to distinguish certain interesting and relevant aspects of the phenomenon. A fallacy is usually defined as an argument, or more broadly speaking, an argumentative move, which fails to comply with certain standards of good argumentation, or fails to provide good justification for the conclusion, but which at the same time is persuasive. So I'm going to consider these three dimensions and look at the phenomenon from these three, or concerning these three perspectives, dimensions. From a pragmatic perspective, is it an argument, or exactly what it is? What is this use of language? Does it provide good justification, and can it be persuasive? Okay, the pragmatic dimension, is it an argument? Well, we might kind of naively try to reconstruct it as an inference or as an argument. I am competent with the relevant technical vocabulary, therefore I possess expert knowledge on this topic. This is a possible reconstruction, but The concept of an argument is usually understood as a kind of speech act, a kind of use of language in which certain assertions are made in support of a conclusion, and that they together support the conclusion. It is sometimes defined as a complex speech act, a constellation of statements that express assertives in which propositions are expressed, which count as an attempt by us to justify or to refute a claim to the satisfaction of the listener. This is the definition we find in a classic book by Van Emeren and Grutendorst on the speech act of arguing. Now, no speech act of arguing obviously is performed in these cases, and the speaker says things about the examples we've seen, right, are about different things, but they are not arguments in favor of having expertise in this sense. Now, one might suggest that this is somehow indirectly implied, maybe a form of a conversational implicature, and one might suggest that there's something having to do with the maxim of manner. For instance, consider this pair of sentences. You might say a simple thing like, "You seem to have caught a cold," and you might express more or less the same content in very technical and sophisticated terms, like, "You have symptoms of a viral infection disease of the upper respiratory tract." Assuming that these two sentences say more or less the same thing, well, maybe this is a big assumption, but if we accept that assumption, then the conversational implicature might be something like, "I'm competent with the technical vocabulary. I'm using this sophisticated terminology to say the same thing because I want you to see that I'm able to do it," right? The maxim of manner is violated, which among other things says, "Be brief." The speaker is not brief, but rather sophisticated and unnecessarily complex in the formulation. This, and we might find other examples, such as if we think about the psychophysical identification identifications that Kripke talks about, C-fiber stimulation and pain, which have the same express the same content, but they are but they use different vocabulary. That we might find examples of that kind. Still, it's probably impossible to find it in every case. Not always possible to find an alternative way to convey the same content in non-technical language. And if we look at sophisticated theories about that we find in any scientific field, that's probably not possible. Therefore, this is probably not a good suggestion. A probably more serious problem is that this kind of use of language does not fulfill the cooperative principle. The speaker is not cooperative. The speaker is not using language with intention to cooperate because she or he is clearly avoiding cooperation and does not have the intention to be understood, given the scenario in which the expert or pseudo expert uses this language. So the cooperative principle is not fulfilled. Therefore, the implicature, the hypothesis fails. Okay. It's useful, I want to suggest to consider the classical Gricean analysis of speaker meaning, which goes like this in a very simplified form. In uttering a certain sentence, you have symptoms of an infectious disease of the upper respiratory tract. The speaker means that P means that they are an expert. If the speaker intends H to believe P, intends the audience to believe B, intends H to recognize the first intention and the recognition of that intention to be part of the reason to believe P. Now, as with other typical counterexample to crisis analysis, I think in this case, the analysis fails. The third condition is not fulfilled. I would say the recognition of that intention is not part of the reason to believe B. Actually, it's the very use of the technical language that is evidence of competence with the technical language. And in many cases, even the second intention is not fulfilled because the speaker does not want the audience to recognize that they want them to believe that they are experts, but rather it's somehow hidden. The intention is in some cases at least somehow hidden, not an open intention. Okay, so if this is the case, what we see is that we have a case similar to other counterexample to crisis analysis in which the first two conditions are fulfilled, but not the third one. We might think of the examples that Grice gives in his classic paper in which the child just before passing out shows her mother the pale face, so that with intention that she believes he's not feeling well, right? Or showing the bandaged leg with intention to give evidence that your leg is hurt and so you're not able to join the football game. So we have cases in which there's evidence that is provided. And this evidence is not, it's non-natural meaning of some kind, and it is, sorry, it's natural meaning of some kind, it's evidence of some, in this case of linguistic competence, and on that basis, on the basis of that evidence, the speaker invites the audience to infer, I possess expert knowledge on the topic. So it's kind of a way to show evidence and to invite the audience to infer that the speaker possesses expert knowledge, but there is no cooperation, and it is not a kind of speaker meaning. It's not part of what the speaker says or implies or intentionally conveys or speaker means. Okay, concerning the second question or the second dimension, the epistemic dimension, the dimension of the evidence, is this good or bad justification? Okay, I'm going to skip this. So Collins and Evans distinguish various levels of expertise and argue for what they call the principle of downward discrimination. They say that only the downward direction is reliable, in the sense that only someone who has more expertise or a better expert knowledge that someone else could evaluate the quality or the level of expertise of someone, but not somebody who has is on an inferior level of knowledge. They have a classification of levels of expertise, so the principle of downward discrimination reads: only the downward direction is reliable, the other direction tends to lead to wrong impressions of reliability. However, this is a very skeptical solution. It implies that the novice is never in a position to reliably judge an expert, cannot have good reasons to know that somebody is an expert or not. So the reply to our question, is it good evidence or not? Is competence with technical language a good evidence of expertise? the answer is negative, because it's always negative when it comes from concerns the layperson. A more mild position is taken by Goldman in the paper that I quoted. Goldman identifies different sources of indirect evidence of expertise. He says, well, one kind of source is the arguments that the expert present in support of their views and criticizing rival views. The existence of agreement with other putative experts. Appraisals by meta-experts, that is, possession of certifications, credentials, diplomas, and titles, and so on. Evidence of biases and interest, which might count negatively towards the kind of expertise that one has. If one is very biased in their research, then probably they are not, they don't have such a high level of expertise, or their knowledge is compromised in a sense. And past track records, such as success in previous research done on a particular topic, for instance. Now, concerning the first point, the argumentative evidence from the way the speaker, the arguments that the speaker gives, Goldman says the novice does not have the capacity to evaluate directly the strength of those arguments, because that would need a lot of information concerning the field and the topic, which the novice by definition doesn't have. Still, Goldman says the novice might obtain what he calls indirect argumentative justification of the speaker's level of expertise, by which he means that in a debate between two experts or putative experts, dialectical superiority is a reason to choose one way or the other. All right, if one of the speakers has the capacity to provide arguments, to reject objections, to reply, to answer questions, and so on, and that counts as a reason in favor of their expertise. Dialectical superiority may reasonably be taken as an indicator of the speakers having superior expertise on the question at issue. However, he adds it's non-conclusive indicator. He also comments quickness and smoothness in doing so, in replying, in providing arguments, in suggest that one has already thought in advance about possible objections and questions, and is suggest a certain level of knowledge and competence. So that's also a kind of evidence, but again, he comments, but these are problematic and indications of informational mastery. Why are they problematic? Quickness and smoothness, dialectical superiority, why are they problematic? Well, they're problematic because skilled debaters can sometimes appear better informed and more knowledgeable because of their stylistic polish, which is not a true indicator of superior expertise. This makes the proper use of indirect argumentative justification a very delicate matter. Skilled debaters might have the ability to reply to objections and so on without really having better knowledge of the topic, just that they thought in advance and they are more more experienced debaters. Okay, so I suggest that an analogous point should be made about technical vocabulary. The fact that somebody seems to be using what from the perspective of the novice looks like technical competence with technical vocabulary is really inconclusive evidence of real competence and therefore of a real expertise on the topic. Simply because, again, there's so many situations in which pseudo-experts pretend to have that knowledge or are able to use the language, a technical vocabulary incorrectly, but with sufficient smoothness and quickness as to suggest that they're competent on the topic. Here's a few quotes from people who have pointed this out. Purveyors of pseudoscience explicitly use scientific publications, language, and typical features such as graphs and formulas to convince people that they are dealing with genuine scientific and thus reliable information. They use technical language, scientific language, to, or something that looks like scientific language, right? And which is not good evidence of competence with scientific language. Here's another quote from our colleague Adrian Briciu: pseudoscientific claims dress up so to look reliable, often by mimicking superficial features of science. They mimic, pseudoscientists mimic the language of scientists, and from the perspective of the novice, it's impossible to discriminate, right? So I want to suggest that that it's inconclusive evidence, that it's not good evidence. Of course, it might, it's inconclusive evidence if we take it separately, independently of anything else we know about the person speaking, right? If we, it might be a good reason if it is corroborated with other kinds of information, if we have other clues or indications that the person is an expert, then this corroborates what we already know, but independently is not sufficient evidence to conclude that somebody has a certain kind of expert knowledge, even a minimal kind of expert knowledge, with which Collins and Evans call interactional expertise, the capacity to interact with experts and to be able to discuss in their language. Okay, and now to the last point, the one concerning persuasiveness. Is this actually persuasive or not? Leaving aside the intuitions, I have found very little empirical studies on this question, whether this this kind of technical language is persuasive or not. Sorial even says there is no study of this particular phenomenon, empirical study of how persuasive the language or mimicking the language of science is in well, in conveying that, or in pursuing the audience that one is an expert. But there are a lot of studies about issues or about things that are very much related to this, such as this paper from Zaboskia and Theriot discuss a lot of studies that have been done before, and which study aspects of presenting a text in scientific formats, such as using references, citations, even if they're gibberish and irrelevant citations or even false. It's just the fact that a paper uses a system of citation or has a discussion of methods. Those methods they invoke might be completely absurd or impractical, etc. But when there is a discussion of methods, the use of passive voice, it has been determined, and so on. All these increase the perceived scientificness of a text, and they say that even small linguistic changes, such as hedging, qualifying the claims that one makes, possibly it seems that, and so on, are viewed as a mark of academic writing, serious writing, scientific writing, and so on, while sensational and extraordinary claims, such as a revolutionary treatment, a cure that we might find in the media, indicate an overzealousness to persuade a reader, and are indications precisely of the opposite. And moreover, these studies, and this is important, have shown that there is a correlation between the perceived scientificness of a text and its perceived credibility. So not only that these texts are perceived as more scientific, but also they are perceived as more credible. Therefore, if we add technical vocabulary, use of technical vocabulary, even if it's non-accommodative, that is the audience cannot understand it, then well, so the situation is analogous, right? So we might draw similar conclusions or expect similar conclusions. It's also persuasive to the extent that it suggests or indicates that the text is more scientific, whether really more scientific or only mimicking science. That's a different issue. Okay, so just to wrap up everything and kind of restate the partial conclusions or suggestions that I have made so far. Non-accommodative technical language is not part of speaker meaning, is not something the speaker asserts or implicates, but rather it is a form of showing evidence, real evidence, or just made up evidence or bad evidence, but still it's a way of showing evidence and not a way of not part of speaker meaning. On the other hand, I have argued that there are reasons to think it's inconclusive evidence of possession of expert knowledge, and also there are reasons to think that it's persuasive. So to a certain extent, it does somewhat fit the profile of a fallacy or of a fallacious argumentative move, although it is not really a fallacy according to most definitions of a fallacy, but it does fit that profile. And that's all. These are some of the references, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrei, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is joining me in using the virtual applause button. This has been absolutely fantastic, and it does leave us up to 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, please make yourselves known by raising your virtual hand or in chat. Either way is just fine. This would be the ideal time to do it. Well, I guess I'm going to break the ice and ask a question of my own until people sort of voice theirs. So, Andrei, this has been quite interesting, but I suppose I wanted to ask you something about the decisiveness of the considerations you've put forward. So somebody could say, look, what's at issue in what you've approached is the relationship between expertise on the one hand in any given domain, be it in some kind of medical science, be it in chess, be it in linear algebra or whatnot. So expertise in a specific domain on the one hand, and on the other hand, using some kind of technical jargon. Right? And somebody could say, well, look, suppose you have a genuine expert, okay, and they say how they see things in a sure tone of voice, okay. They give you what seems to be their assessment of the situation at hand, how they conceive of it, and so on. So if it's a physician, they might produce a diagnosis. Or if it's an engineer, they might produce a design model or something of the sort. They tell you this is it, okay? Now, question, it might be that they're speaking qua experts. It might be that this is their considered view and their expertise is getting the better of them. On the one hand. On the other hand, it might be that in their history of expert learning, they've acquired a sort of overconfidence bias, right? And when they speak their minds, what they're really betraying isn't the domain-specific knowledge and expertise that they possess, but rather it seems that significantly enough at work is they're being overconfident in what they say. And so it would be rationally optimal to look for further evidence and so on. Now, this seems to be the kind of thing that happens with people who are genuine experts. And there's a kind of neat and slippery slope from being right and trusting yourself to relying on yourself ever so more, even in those cases when you happen to produce inexact descriptions of the situation, right? And so it seems to be the kind of evidence that often accompanies genuine expertise as well. And so the point I'm getting at here is this. It would seem that whenever you have a show of technical language, right, of jargon specific to a given domain, there will always be a question of whether that evinces genuine expertise or whether that evinces some kind of related bias with respect to that. And so I wonder if that, so you've went through a couple of slides where you were suggesting, well, what is evidence for what? So sure, their genuine expertise is evidence for the justification of their statements, but there's also putative evidence to the contrary. Right, so there will always be this kind of balance of conflicting evidence, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And I was wondering if you, if the work and the pragmatics of argumentation that you've referred to here sort of shows us the way out of that conundrum, right?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. I'm not sure. So you're referring to situations in which the expert is a real expert, right, and uses correctly the language of the domain that they are well working on, but the conclusions that they come to, right, are not really supported by the evidence or by the data that they have, and they're biased in some sense, and they arrive to some different conclusions. I'm not really, so I was not so much interested in that part, right, but rather in the way in which we assess whether the person speaking is actually an expert or not. Right, and whether the language of the expertise or language of the discourse that the putative expert uses is or not good evidence. Now, I'm not an epistemologist, so I might be missing a lot of very important things. That's why I'm saying is just a very non-definitive suggestion that the evidence is not good evidence. Does that make sense? Does that?
So it makes perfect sense, and I think I wholeheartedly agree with you. I was just wondering if there's anything more substantive we could say. So just starting from display of technical language, there is defeasible evidence to the effect that the person in question is an expert, and the evidence is genuine. It's not just a seemingness of evidence. It's often a pro tanto reason to think that these people are experts, but it's also defeasible. So there could be other evidence to the contrary that we're not sort of getting just by looking at the text in question. So yeah, is there anything sort of more metaphysically sort of appealing that we could get out of that, or is it just?
I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't say that it is defeasible evidence, because. But again, maybe I'm entering here a certain topic that I'm not really enough familiar with. The evidence that we have is not only that it's not it's defeasible, but it's not really good evidence, because from the perspective of the novice, we don't know whether that discourse is really genuine, technical, correct discourse, or it's just a misuse, right? So the examples that I gave went from cases in which arguably the ad in the Style magazine, it's non-accommodative use of language, but arguably it's correct use of language, at least maybe not everything. When they say that it comes from Switzerland and so on, there's a little fishy there, it seems, but arguably there were some technical experts who advised in making that ad, right? In contrast to what some philosophers do when they introduce scientific terminology in their work, and even worse, what pseudoscientists do when they just make a mess out of the scientific terminology, right? So from the perspective of the novice, it's really not difficult. It's really not possible to know whether Lacan is using correctly or not the terminology. Right now, in the case of the ad, you might have all kinds of indirect kind of evidence. It's a good magazine. Supposedly somebody looked at that before it was published. I don't know. Maybe we might have some. It's a product that had to go through some kind of testing before by some public institutions and so on. So we might suspect that it's not completely gibberish what the ad is saying, right? In contrast to but these are different kinds of evidence that we might have, right? So these do not relate to the very question whether the language in itself, from the perspective of the novice, is good evidence or not.
Right. Thank you so much, Andrei. This has been quite helpful and informative. Thanks. Next up, we have a quick question from Dan Zeman. Dan, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I think I'm just it's a follow-up, I'm afraid. If somebody else has a proper question, I'm happy to yield the floor. But I'm just wondering whether, Andrei, so, I mean, I guess my question is, which is probably what you argue for, but how can just the proffering of scientific jargon be evidence for anything in a sense? Because like Andrei, I'm a bit puzzled. So imagine there's this actor in a play and they're just reciting some absolutely correct, state of the art, everybody agrees, theories in physics, right? Would that enough be? It doesn't even make sense to think that is evidence for that person having any kind of expertise. So why would just saying these kind of things be an indication of anything, right? So I guess that's your conclusion in a way, but
well, no. So my conclusion is
okay.
Yeah. Well, right. Just very quick answer. That's a very specific kind of situation you're thinking about, right? So an actor, the actor is impersonating a character. Well, maybe it's the character that we need to think about whether they have expertise or not, and so on, right? But if it's a proper use of language in the sense that it's somebody making assertions, and there are, there's evidence that they're making assertions and they're not just playing or fooling around or just using language, joking with jargon that they heard, there's a reason to think that there's at least prima facie a reason to think that is evidence of expertise. You're saying it's not even a prima facie. Nobody would have ever thought that. Well, I took it that many people might think that, right? That it's a prima facie reason of expertise, although I think it's not a good one, right?
Right.
In a sense, I'm agreeing with your conclusion.
Yeah, so you have to look at the context a little bit, right? And maybe
right,
the intentions
of course, right.
So, right, yeah. Exactly.
So my examples were already placed in a context that is of that kind, right? So it's
okay. Sorry. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for the follow-up, and Andrei for answering. This has been quite a lovely talk, and so please join me once again in thanking Dr. Andrei Moldovan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.